At my daughter's wedding, just as more than 200 guests raised their glasses, she took the microphone pointed straight at me and said, "This monster is my father. Those scars make people sick, and he's losing his mind." The ballroom fell silent. No one knew those burn scars came from the night I carried her out of a burning house 15 years earlier. As security started toward me, the ballroom doors swung open. An older man walked calmly to the stage holding nothing but a black envelope. That's when everything changed. If you found your way to this story today, I'm glad you did. Tell me in the comments, what city or country are you joining from? You'd be surprised how far these stories travel. This story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and meaningful reflection. Any similarity to actual names or locations is coincidental, but the message it carries for you is one I stand behind entirely. The ballroom at the Grand Hotel in Birmingham, Alabama, holds 200 people comfortably. That night, it held 200 people and one secret that was about to stop being a secret. I had dressed carefully that morning. Dark suit, white shirt, top button fastened all the way up. My daughter was getting married, and I was going to look like a man who had his life together, even if it meant spending the evening with my collar pressed against the scars that ran from the base of my jaw down across my shoulder and back. 73 years old, and I still hadn't found a way to walk into a room full of strangers without thinking about what they'd see if they looked too closely. The chandeliers threw gold light across the white orchids and pressed linen tablecloths. A string quartet played something I didn't recognize near the far wall. Around me, men in tailored suits laughed at things that weren't quite funny enough to laugh at, and women in evening gowns clinked champagne flutes and talked about real estate and vacation homes in places I'd never been. I sat at the front table, the one Tiffany had assigned me, right where she'd put me, and I watched my daughter move through the room like she'd been born inside it. She looked beautiful. I want to say that clearly because what happened next had nothing to do with how she looked and everything to do with what was underneath it. Austin sat beside me, his knee bouncing under the table the way it did when he was anxious. He was 28 years old and trying very hard to look calm. He wasn't pulling it off. "You okay, Dad?" he said quietly, leaning toward me. "I'm fine," I told him. "You keep touching your collar." I lowered my hand. Old habit. He opened his mouth to say something else, but the lights went out before he could get the words out. Not a flicker. Not a gradual fade. One moment the ballroom was full of gold light and the sound of 200 people enjoying themselves, and the next moment it was black and quiet in a way that made every person in the room go absolutely still. A few women gasped. Someone knocked over a glass, and the sound of it hitting the floor was very loud. Then the spotlight came on. It was a single beam, stark white, the kind of light they use on theater stages when they want you to look at one thing and nothing else. It swept across the ballroom slowly, deliberately, like a searchlight, and it found me sitting at the front table with my hand halfway back to my collar. I heard Tiffany's voice before I understood what was happening. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said from somewhere above me, and I looked up to find her standing at the edge of the stage, one hand wrapped around a microphone, the other raised toward the massive LED screen that covered the back wall of the ballroom. I want to take a moment to introduce someone very special. The screen behind her lit up. My face filled it wall to wall, 20 feet across. The spotlight and the camera together had found the angle Tiffany needed, the one that caught the left side of my neck, where the scarring was worst, where the skin had pulled and puckered and never quite gone back to anything resembling normal. In the harsh white light magnified to the size of a billboard, my scars looked like something from a nightmare. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I felt it in my throat. My hands gripped the edge of the tablecloth, and I heard the fabric pull taut. "This," Tiffany said, her voice carrying the practiced sweetness of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times. is why I have never introduced my father in public before." She tilted her head, and her expression arranged itself into something that looked from a distance like concern. Up close, I could see it was something else entirely. Not only does his appearance cause distress to those around him, but his mental state has deteriorated to the point where his presence in our family home has become impossible. The room erupted into a low, confused murmuring. I could feel 200 pairs of eyes moving between the screen and the man sitting at the front table, trying to reconcile the two. "Tonight," Tiffany continued, her voice brightening, as though she were announcing a toast, "with the support of my husband Julian and the blessing of this community, I will be arranging for my father to be transferred to a specialized memory care facility where he can receive the treatment he needs." The murmuring sharpened into something uglier. I heard a man near the back say, "What on earth?" and a woman at the table to my left put her hand over her mouth, but I couldn't tell if she was horrified or entertained. Julian stood at the edge of the stage, arms folded, a small, satisfied smile on his face. He caught my eye and held it just long enough to make sure I understood exactly what was happening. Then Austin stood up. His chair scraped back so hard it nearly fell. He grabbed the edge of our table with both hands, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle working in his cheek. "Tiffany." His voice cracked on her name like a whip. "Stop." "Austin, sit down," Tiffany said smoothly, barely glancing at him. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me plenty." He was shaking now, a full-body tremor he was trying to hold together through sheer will. "You want to tell 200 people that Dad is losing his mind. Fine. You explain to them how a man losing his mind managed to raise both of us. You explain that." Julian stepped forward from the edge of the stage and made a small gesture toward the back of the room. 2 security guards in black suits began moving through the tables toward us. I rose to my feet. My legs felt unsteady, and the spotlight was so bright it was hard to see anything beyond the first few rows of tables. But I stood up straight, the way I had been trained to do back when standing straight meant something, back when there was still a unit around me and a mission in front of me. Austin stepped directly in front of me, planting himself between the approaching guards and his father. He grabbed the microphone from the nearest speaker stand, and his voice rang out across the ballroom, raw and furious and absolutely certain. "The only person in this room who needs help," he said, "is you, Tiffany, and every person here is about to find out exactly why." One of the guards reached for his arm. Austin jerked back, keeping himself between the guard and me, his free hand pressed flat against my chest, as if he could hold me together by force. "Don't," he said to the guard. "One word." The guard stopped. The ballroom had gone so still that I could hear the ice settling in the water glasses. Then from the back of the room, both doors swung open at once. A man walked in. He was 70 years old, broad-shouldered with silver hair, and the posture of someone who had never quite left the military behind. In his right hand, he carried a black envelope. He didn't hurry. He didn't look around at the crowd, or the lights, or the screen. He walked straight down the center aisle with the kind of calm that doesn't come from having nothing to lose. It comes from having already decided exactly what you're willing to do. He stopped at the foot of the stage, looked up at Tiffany, and spoke in a voice that didn't need a microphone to reach every corner of that room. "Stop," Marcus Reeves said. "Right now. To understand why a man who was once respected across the state of Alabama ended up on a 20-foot screen like a carnival exhibit, you have to go back 20 years. You have to go back to the sand, to the smoke, to the particular sound that a vehicle makes when the fire inside it has reached the fuel line and there is no more time left for careful decisions. You have to go back to Kandahar." I was 52 years old in the autumn of 2004, which meant I was old enough to know better and stubborn enough not to care. I had been a combat medic for nearly 2 decades by then, long enough to know that the Army doesn't send its best field surgeons to the front lines because it values their surgical skills. It sends them because it values what happens when a wounded man looks up and sees someone running toward him instead of away. That was the job. Run toward. Always run toward. We were running a supply convoy through a district outside Kandahar on a Tuesday morning when the lead vehicle hit the device in the road. I was riding third in the column, and the blast came without warning. The way blasts always do, a sound so large it stops being a sound and becomes a physical force, something that hits you in the chest and rearranges the air in your lungs before your brain has caught up with what your body already knows. The lead vehicle flipped. It landed on its side in a ditch off the shoulder of the road, and within seconds, the engine compartment was burning. Webb. Sergeant Ray Kowalski was beside me before I had fully registered what had happened, his hand gripping my arm hard enough to leave a mark. Ray was 45, then built like a man who had been constructed specifically for difficult situations, with a voice like gravel and a face that hadn't softened once in all the years I'd known him. Lead vehicle is down, 3 men inside. I was already moving. Webb, wait for... I didn't wait. There was no waiting. The fire was young, and the men inside were not yet dead, and those 2 facts were the only calculation that mattered. The heat hit me 30 feet out a wall of it that pushed back against every instinct a living body has. I went through it anyway, bent low, covering my face with my forearm. The driver's side door had been blown partially open by the force of the flip, and I wrenched it the rest of the way off its hinges with both hands, the metal scorching my palms through my gloves. The first soldier out was barely conscious, 22 years old, by the look of him, one arm hanging at an angle that told me the shoulder was dislocated. I dragged him clear and went back in. The second man was unconscious, bleeding from a gash above his left ear, but breathing. I pulled him out by his vest and got him far enough from the vehicle that Kowalski could take over. The third man was Marcus. Marcus Reeves was 40 years old in 2004, a staff sergeant with 14 years of service and a reputation for being the kind of soldier other soldiers wanted next to them when things went wrong. He was pinned by the dashboard, which had buckled inward during the flip, and caught him across both legs. He was conscious. He was also completely calm, which told me he either didn't understand how bad it was or understood it completely. "Arthur," he said when I reached him. His voice was steady, infuriatingly steady. "The fuel line is compromised." "I know. There's maybe 90 seconds before this gets significantly worse." "I know that too." I was already working at the dashboard with both hands, trying to find the angle I needed. "Stop narrating and help me find your right foot." "My right foot is currently somewhere behind the emergency brake." "Then help me find the emergency brake." He almost smiled at that. Even then. Even with the fire 4 feet from his face, he almost smiled. It took both of us and every second of that 90-second window. I got the dashboard shifted enough to free his left leg, and Marcus pulled himself the rest of the way out with his arms. Alone, his teeth clenched against a pain he refused to put a sound to. I grabbed him under both arms, and we moved half running, half falling away from the vehicle. The second explosion came when we were 12 feet clear. The force of it knocked us both flat. I felt the heat across the back of my neck and shoulders like a wave, and then I was on the ground with Marcus, and the sky above us was full of black smoke, and the smell of burning fuel, and the distant sound of Kowalski shouting coordinates into his radio. Marcus turned his head and looked at me. His face was covered in dust, and there was a cut across his cheekbone that was bleeding freely down his jaw, and his eyes were full of something that wasn't fear and wasn't relief, but was somewhere between the two. The particular expression of a man who has just watched his own death step back and choose someone else. "Arthur," he said, and his voice cracked on my name for the first time in the 14 years I had known him. His hand found my arm in the rubble and gripped it. "Arthur, your neck." I reached up. The skin along the back of my neck and across my left shoulder felt tight and wrong in a way that I recognized from training but had never felt on my own body before. I brought my hand back and looked at it. "Huh," I said. "That's your response." Marcus pushed himself up onto one elbow, staring at me. His eyes were red from the smoke, and when he blinked, I saw that they were wet too. Not from the smoke. "You pull me out of a burning vehicle and your response is, huh? I've had worse mornings." "Arthur." His grip on my arm tightened until I could feel each individual finger. "I need you to understand something. Whatever you need for the rest of my life, you call me. You hear me, whatever you need." I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked up at the smoke rising into the blue Afghan sky, and I thought about my children back home in Alabama, about Tiffany, who was 12, and Austin, who was 7, and about the fact that I was lying in a ditch in Kandahar, with burns on my neck and my hands, and I was still somehow alive. "What I need right now," I told Marcus, "is a medic, which is unfortunate because I appear to be the medic." He laughed then. A full, broken, helpless laugh that turned into something that might have been crying, except that Marcus Reeves didn't cry, so I decided not to mention it. Kowalski appeared above us, blocking the sun, his face creased with something I had never seen on it before, and would only see a handful of times afterward. Relief so deep it looked like pain. "Both of you in one piece," he demanded. "More or less," Marcus said. "Webb, your neck looks like—" "I know what it looks like, Ray." Kowalski dropped to one knee beside me and put his hand on my shoulder, careful to avoid the burns. He had been in the army for 23 years, and he was not a man who touched people easily, and the fact that he did it anyway told me more about how bad it looked than any mirror could have. "You ran into a burning vehicle," he said. "Twice. 3 men were inside." "You ran in twice, Arthur." "3 men," I said again. He shook his head slowly. His jaw was working the way it did when he had something to say and wasn't sure it would come out right. Finally, he said, "You're going to get a commendation for this." "I don't need a commendation." "No," Kowalski said, "but you're going to get one anyway." He was right. 6 months later, back in Alabama, I stood in a dress uniform and accepted a Purple Heart from a general whose name I have since forgotten. My neck and shoulder were still healing. Tiffany stood at the edge of the ceremony and looked at her shoes. Austin stood beside me and held my hand the entire time, even though he was 8 years old and probably too old to be holding his father's hand in public. He held it anyway. That fire in Kandahar burned away some of my skin and gave me a commendation I never asked for, and a debt of loyalty from Marcus Reeves that he would spend the next 20 years figuring out how to repay. He finally found a way. But to understand that part, I have to tell you about another fire. One that happened 6 years later in a little house in Alabama on a winter night when the temperature dropped below freezing and the wiring in the upstairs hallway gave out without any warning at all. The house on Callaway Road was not a large house, but it was ours. I had bought it the year after I came back from my first deployment, back when the neighborhood was quiet, and the oak trees in the front yard were young enough that you could still see them from the porch. By 2010, the oaks had grown tall enough to block the streetlight, and the upstairs hallway ran along the north wall, where the insulation had thinned over the years without anyone noticing. Including me. Especially me. I should have caught it. I was a man who had spent 20 years paying attention to the things that could kill you. And I missed the one thing in my own home that nearly did. December 14th was a Thursday. I know that because I had been at the VA hospital for a checkup that afternoon and had come home with a grocery bag in each arm, and the particular kind of tiredness that comes not from the appointment itself, but from all the waiting beforehand. Austin was asleep by 8:30. He had a school project due the next morning and had worked himself into exhaustion, finishing it at the kitchen table, his head dropping toward his construction paper, until I carried him upstairs and put him to bed with his shoes still on. Tiffany was in her room with the door closed, which was her default position those days. She was 12, and 12 had arrived in our house like a weather system that nobody had predicted and nobody knew how to dress for. I fell asleep in the armchair in the living room sometime after 10, which is the kind of thing that happens when you are 58 years old and the couch is closer than the bedroom. I don't know exactly what woke me. Not the smoke, not yet, the smoke came later. What woke me was a sound, a soft, irregular crackling from somewhere above the ceiling, the kind of sound a house makes when something inside its walls is doing something it was never designed to do. I had heard enough things burning in my life to recognize it before I was fully awake. I was up and moving before my eyes had fully adjusted to the dark. The smoke hit me at the top of the stairs, thin at first, then thicker as I turned toward the hallway. The wiring inside the north wall had gone, and the fire had been working its way through the insulation for long enough that by the time I got there, the hallway ceiling above Tiffany's door was glowing orange along the seams. I got Austin first because his room was closest. I shook him awake, pulled him out of bed, pushed him toward the stairs. "Go to Mrs. Simmons next door," I told him. "Don't stop, don't look back, go." He was 7 years old and terrified, and he did exactly what I told him. I heard his feet on the stairs, and then the front door, and then nothing, and I turned back toward the hallway. Tiffany's door was hot to the touch, not the kind of hot that makes you pull your hand back. The kind of hot that tells you the air on the other side has already changed into something a person shouldn't be breathing. I opened it anyway. The room was full of smoke, and the ceiling above her bed had begun to buckle, one of the cross beams sagging downward under heat it was never built to withstand. Tiffany was awake and on her feet, coughing so hard her whole body shook, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes streaming. "Dad!" Her voice came out small and rough, nothing like the voice she used when she wanted something and everything, like the voice of the little girl she still was underneath all that 12-year-old armor. "Dad, I can't, the window won't." "I know." I crossed the room in 4 steps. "Don't talk. Get low." The window had swollen in its frame from the heat and wouldn't budge. I hit it once with my elbow, and it gave cold December air rushing in and briefly making everything worse as the fresh oxygen hit the fire. The beam above us cracked. It came down at an angle, the burning end dropping toward Tiffany's left side. There was no time to think about it. I stepped between her and the beam and took it across the back of my neck and left shoulder the wood scorching through my shirt and into the skin beneath it in the space of one breath. I felt it the way you feel a bad burn, which is to say you feel the heat first and the pain a half-second later when your nervous system catches up with what has happened to it. I pushed Tiffany toward the window. "Go. Now. Drop to the porch roof and slide down." "Dad, you're—" "Tiffany." I put both hands on her shoulders and looked at her through the smoke. Her face was streaked with tears and ash, and her eyes were wide and locked on my neck on whatever she could see happening there that I couldn't yet feel the full extent of. "Go. Right now." She went. I heard her hit the porch roof, heard the scrape of her sliding down, heard her land in the front yard. By the time I got myself out through the same window, the beam had fully collapsed, and Tiffany's room was no longer a room anyone would recognize. Dorothy Simmons was already in our front yard when I came around the side of the house. She was 63 years old, had lived next door for 22 years, and had a habit of appearing at exactly the moment she was most needed, which was a talent I had long since stopped trying to explain. She was in her bathrobe with Austin pressed against her side, Her arms wrapped around him, her lips moving in what I had come to recognize over the years as a quiet, continuous prayer that she ran like background software whenever the world gave her reason to. Austin saw me and broke away from Dorothy and ran. He hit me somewhere around the midsection and held on with both arms, and his whole body was shaking with sobs that had gone beyond sound into something silent and physical and total. "Dad," he kept saying into my shirt. "Dad. Dad. Dad." I held him with my good arm. The other one I kept still because the shoulder had begun to make itself known in a way that suggested moving it was not currently an option. Dorothy came to me with her eyes full of tears and her jaw set in that particular way she had of refusing to fall apart when someone else needed her to hold together. She looked at my neck, and what she saw there made her press her hand over her mouth for just a moment before she lowered it. "Arthur," she said. "Oh, Arthur." "I'm all right, Dot." "You are not all right. The kids are all right. That's the same thing." She shook her head at me the way she had been shaking her head at me for 22 years and pulled out her phone to call 911. Tiffany stood 10 feet away in the snow. She was unhurt, not a mark on her. Her hair was tangled and her face was still streaked with ash, but her skin was whole, and her arms and her hands and her neck were exactly as they had always been. She was staring at me at the left side of my neck, where the burn was already doing what bad burns do in the cold air, tightening and darkening, and making itself impossible to look at, and impossible to look away from. I waited for her to come to me. I waited for her to run the way Austin had run, arms wide, that complete and uncomplicated collision want of a child who loves their parent and needs to prove it with their body. She took one step toward me. Then she stopped. "Tiffany," I said. "Come here, honey." She wrapped her arms around herself instead. She looked at my neck once more, and then she looked away somewhere past my left shoulder, somewhere that was not me. Her face had closed over like a window being shut. "I'm okay," she said, to nobody in particular. To the yard, to the snow, to the burning house behind me. "I'm fine." The fire trucks arrived 4 minutes later. I remember the lights more than the sirens, red and white, strobing across the snow, and the oak trees, and my daughter's face as she stood apart from the rest of us, her arms still wrapped around herself, still not looking at me. I told myself she was in shock. Trauma presents differently in different people, especially in children, and a trained medic knows better than to read too much into behavior in the immediate aftermath of a frightening event. I told myself that. I kept telling myself that for 15 years. People used to ask me how two children raised under the same roof by the same father, eating at the same kitchen table and watching the same television and sitting through the same summer thunderstorms on the same front porch could grow up to be so completely different from each other. I never had a good answer for that question. I think I do now. The years after the fire on Callaway Road did not pass the way I expected them to. I had assumed the way parents do when they survive something frightening together, that the experience would bind us, that Tiffany would come out of it with some new understanding of what I had done, of what the scars on my neck actually meant, and where they had come from. I assumed that gratitude, even if she never said it out loud, would be there underneath everything else, a foundation neither of us needed to discuss, because we both already knew it was there. I was wrong about that. I was wrong in a way that took me years to fully understand. Tiffany came back from the fire, the same girl she had been going into it, except quieter about certain things and louder about others. She stopped mentioning me to her friends at school, which I discovered by accident one afternoon when I drove to pick her up, and one of her classmates pointed at my truck and said loudly enough for half the parking lot to hear, "Is that your dad?" and Tiffany's face did something I had never seen it do before. It went blank in a way that was not blankness at all, but something she had practiced, a careful arrangement of features designed to communicate nothing while communicating everything. "He's just someone giving me a ride," she said. She was 14. I was 56. I sat in that truck and waited for her to get in, and when she did, she put her earbuds in before the door was fully closed and looked out the passenger window the entire way home. I didn't say anything about it. I told myself that teenagers were territorial about their social lives, that this was normal, that it would pass. It didn't pass. By the time Tiffany was 16, she had established a set of rules around me that she never stated directly, but enforced with absolute consistency. I was not to come to her school events. I was not to answer the door when her friends came over. At family dinners with her mother's side of the family, I should wear long sleeves, regardless of the temperature, and I should sit at the far end of the table where the lighting was low enough that people wouldn't look too closely. The summer she was 17, I found out she had told people at her new part-time job that her father had passed away. Dorothy told me. She hadn't meant to. It slipped out during one of our Wednesday evening conversations on her back porch, and the moment it did, she reached over and put her hand on my arm with the expression of someone who has just accidentally confirmed something they had hoped the other person didn't know. "Arthur," she said, "I'm so sorry. I thought you knew." "I didn't know," I said. "She's young. I know how old she is, Dot." I went home that night and sat in the kitchen for a long time without turning on the lights. Not because I was devastated, though I was, but because I was trying to understand how a man who had walked into a burning building twice in his life, who had put his own body between his daughter and a falling beam, could end up being the thing she was most ashamed of. I didn't arrive at an answer. I am still not sure there is one. Austin was different in every way that mattered. He had always been different. Even as a small boy, he had a quality that I can only describe as attentiveness, the ability to notice things that other people walked past without seeing. He noticed when I favored my left shoulder on cold mornings. He noticed when I had been to the VA hospital because I came home quieter than usual. He noticed which days the old burns pulled tighter than others, and on those days he would appear in the kitchen doorway after dinner and say with the casual air of someone suggesting a completely ordinary thing, "I looked up some new stretches for scar tissue, Dad. You want to try them?" He was 12 years old the first time he said that. He had looked it up himself in a library book because the internet in our house was slow, and he had ridden his bike to the public library on a Saturday morning without telling me where he was going. When he was 16, he told me he wanted to study pharmacology. "Why pharmacology?" I asked. He shrugged the way teenagers shrug when they don't want to make something into a bigger moment than it already is. "Scar tissue management is basically a pharmaceutical problem at the cellular level," he said. "The topical treatments available right now are pretty limited. There's a lot of room for improvement." I looked at him across the kitchen table. He was looking at his textbook, not at me, with the focused expression he wore when he was trying not to show that something mattered to him. "Austin," I said. "Yeah. Is this about my neck?" He turned a page. "It's about pharmacology, Dad." But his ears had gone red the way they always did when he was telling the truth sideways, and I understood that my son had decided at some point between the fire and now to dedicate a significant portion of his professional life to making sure that what had happened to my skin would hurt less for other people. I didn't say anything else about it. Some things are too large for direct conversation. But that night, after he had gone to bed, I sat on the porch for a long time and looked at the Alabama sky, and I felt something I had not felt in a while. Not happiness exactly, closer to wonder. The years moved the way years do when you are raising children alone faster than you expect, and slower than you can afford. Austin grew into a serious, thoughtful young man who called me every Sunday from his college dormitory and who came home for every holiday without being asked. Tiffany grew into a polished, beautiful woman who came home less and less, and when she did, brought with her an increasing number of opinions about what I should and shouldn't do in my own home. I let most of it go. A man learns over time what hills are worth dying on. Then one Sunday afternoon in the spring of 2022, Tiffany came home with a man I had never met. She was smiling, the kind of smile she used when she wanted something wide and warm, and positioned slightly too carefully, like a photograph of a smile rather than the real thing. The man beside her was well-dressed and broad-shouldered, with the kind of tan that comes from golf courses rather than outdoor work, and he extended his hand to me with the polished ease of someone who had made a career out of first impressions. "Mr. Webb," he said, "I've heard so much about you." His grip was firm, practiced. His teeth were very white. His eyes, when they found mine over the handshake, were not smiling at all. "Julian Mercer," he said, "I'm very glad to finally meet you." I shook his hand and smiled back and said the things you say when your daughter brings a man home for the first time. But something in my chest had gone carefully, quietly, still the same stillness that used to come over me in the field when the radio went silent, at a moment when it shouldn't have been silent. In the army, we called that feeling a warning. I had learned a long time ago not to ignore it. His name was Julian Mercer, and he shook my hand like a man who had rehearsed the gesture in front of a mirror until it felt natural enough to pass for real. The first dinner was a Sunday in April. Tiffany had called ahead to say she was bringing someone, which was unusual enough, that I had actually cleaned the living room and put out the good plates, the ones that had been my wife's, and that I normally kept in the cabinet above the refrigerator, where I didn't have to look at them and miss her. Austin drove down from Tuscaloosa for the occasion, which told me he had spoken to his sister and formed opinions he was not yet ready to share out loud. Julian arrived with a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my monthly utility bill, and a compliment about the house that managed to sound like an assessment at the same time. "What a wonderful property," he said, standing in the front hallway and looking around with the particular attention of a man who is calculating square footage. "How long have you been here?" 31 years, I said. "Remarkable. And it's just you now since—" He glanced at Tiffany in a way that communicated something I wasn't meant to catch. "Since you've been on your own." "Since my wife passed," I said. "Yes. Of course." He smiled. The smile reached his mouth and stopped there like a fire that had run out of fuel before it could spread. "Tiffany speaks of her very fondly." Tiffany had not spoken of her mother in my presence in 4 years, but I let that go and asked everyone to sit down. Dinner was the kind of meal where the food is fine and the conversation is exhausting. Julian asked questions with the smooth efficiency of someone who already knows the answers and is checking to see if you'll give them voluntarily. He asked about the neighborhood, about the property taxes, about whether I had considered downsizing now that the children were grown. He asked about my Army pension and my VA benefits with an air of friendly curiosity that had clearly been calibrated to seem casual. Austin sat across from him and ate his pot roast with the focused attention of a man who was listening to every word while appearing to listen to none of them. He caught my eye once across the table and held it for exactly 1 second before looking back at his plate. That second was enough. We had always been able to do that. Austin and I conduct entire conversations in the space between one look and the next. It was during the second glass of wine that Julian said it. "Tiffany mentioned there's a family trust," he said, reaching for the bread basket with the ease of a man asking about the weather. "Her grandfather's, was it?" The table went very quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of people eating, but the tight, pressurized quiet of a room where something has just been said that cannot be unsaid. Tiffany set down her fork. Julian, I only ask because I work in financial planning, he continued smoothly, as though she hadn't spoken. Estate structures can be complicated, especially with the kind of terms that were common in trusts written 30 or 40 years ago. I'd be happy to take a look purely as a courtesy if there are any questions about how it's structured. I looked at him across my wife's good plates and my grandmother's tablecloth and the pot roast I had spent the afternoon making, and I kept my face as neutral as I had learned to keep it in the field when the situation required me to appear calmer than I felt. It's well managed, I said. Thank you. Of course. He smiled again. And the land itself, the parcel on the east side that's been in your family as well. Austin put his fork down. It made a small, deliberate sound against the plate. Julian, he said with a pleasantness in his voice that I recognized as the kind that costs something to maintain. How did you find out about the land? Julian turned to him with an expression of mild surprise, the expression of a man who has been asked a question he was fully prepared for. Tiffany mentioned it, I think. Or perhaps I came across the county records at some point, public information, of course. Of course, Austin said. The conversation moved on to other things. Julian was skilled at moving conversations, the way a good card dealer is skilled at moving cards, quickly, smoothly, in directions that served the hand he was building. After dinner, when Tiffany and Julian had gone to the living room, and Austin was helping me with the dishes, he leaned close and kept his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry. He knew about the trust before tonight, Austin said. And the land. I know. The east parcel alone is worth close to $800,000 with the county development plans. I know that too. Austin scrubbed at a plate with more force than the plate required. His jaw was working the same way it did when he was 17, and trying not to say something he'd regret. Dad, you need to be careful. I am always careful. You're polite, he said. That's not the same thing. He was right about that, and we both knew it. Later that evening, after they had gone, Dorothy came over the way she sometimes did when she had seen Tiffany's car in the driveway and wanted to make sure I was all right. She sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and listened while I told her about the dinner, about the questions, about the way Julian had said something remarkable while looking at my hallway like he was pricing it. Trust your gut, Arthur, she said. You trusted it in Afghanistan. Trust it now. He hasn't done anything, I said. Not yet. No. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at me steadily. But a man who asks about your trust fund at the first dinner isn't building a relationship. He's building a case. She was right. I knew she was right. But knowing something and acting on it are different problems, and the truth was that I had no evidence, no standing, and no recourse. Julian Mercer had done nothing wrong except ask questions and have cold eyes, and know things he should not have known about my family's finances. That was the month of April. By October, 3 things had happened that I did not yet know about. The first was that Julian's investment firm had suffered significant losses in a series of failed commercial real estate ventures, losses large enough that several of his clients had retained lawyers. The second was that Tiffany had begun meeting with a family law attorney in Hoover, a suburb of Birmingham, to discuss the legal process for petitioning the Alabama probate court to declare a parent legally incapacitated, a process known formally as a guardianship petition, which, if granted, would transfer legal decision-making authority over my finances and personal affairs to Tiffany as my appointed guardian. Under Alabama code, a trust structured with an early release clause tied to the grantor's incapacity would become immediately accessible to the named beneficiaries upon the granting of such a petition. $3 million. $800,000 in land. The third thing that happened in October was that nurse Linda Castillo, my care coordinator at the Birmingham Favia Medical Center, called me after my quarterly checkup to go over my results. "Everything looks good, Mr. Webb," she said. Her voice was warm and professionally unhurried, the voice of someone who has learned to deliver information at a pace that doesn't frighten people. "Your blood panel is clean, your blood pressure is slightly elevated, but nothing we need to intervene on yet. I do want to ask, are you sleeping all right? You seemed a little foggy during the cognitive assessment today." "I'm 73, I told her. Foggy is relative." She laughed, but it was a careful laugh, the kind that holds something back. "Fair enough. You know you can call me anytime, Mr. Webb. That's what I'm here for." I thanked her and hung up. That night, I sat on the porch and looked at the Alabama sky and thought about the way Julian Mercer had said remarkable while looking at my house, and about Tiffany's carefully arranged smile, and about the fact that a man who spent 19 years learning to read dangerous situations was sitting on his own front porch in the dark, feeling for the first time in a very long time like the most vulnerable person in the room. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, in a white box with a gold ribbon and a small card in Tiffany's handwriting. "For your scars, Dad. I should have done this a long time ago." I stood in the kitchen holding the box for a long moment. Tiffany had not given me a gift in 11 years. The last one had been a coffee mug for Father's Day, which she had clearly purchased at a gas station on the way over, and which had cracked in the dishwasher after 2 uses. Before that, nothing I could recall. I opened the box. Inside was a cream in a sleek silver tube with a French label, some kind of specialty scar treatment, the card explained, imported from a boutique pharmacy in Zurich. Tiffany had included a printed page of ingredients and clinical trial references, which struck me as thorough, in a way that Tiffany had never previously been thorough about anything involving me. I should have known better. 73 years old, 2 wars, 1 house fire, and I still let a gold ribbon lower my guard. I used the cream that evening before bed, working it into the scar tissue along my neck and shoulder, the way Linda had shown me years ago. It had no smell, which surprised me. Most topical treatments had some kind of medicinal odor. This one felt like nothing, which I told myself was a sign of quality. 3 weeks later, I forgot where I had put my keys 4 times in one morning. I was not a man who lost his keys. I had spent 19 years in an environment where losing equipment had consequences, and the habits of that life had never fully left me. Everything in my house had a place, and everything stayed in its place because that was how I was built. But there were the keys on top of the refrigerator when I had no memory of putting them there. And there was the stove left on after breakfast, the burner glowing orange when I came back through the kitchen at noon. And there was the morning I sat down in the armchair at 9 a.m. and looked up to find that it was somehow 3 in the afternoon, and I had no clear accounting of the hours between. My hands had begun to tremble on cold mornings. Not the minor stiffness of age, which I knew well enough, but something else, a fine, persistent tremor that made holding a coffee cup feel like a task that required concentration. Twice in December, I woke in the night, hearing voices that were not there. They sounded like radio transmissions, broken and overlapping, the kind of audio bleed I remembered from field communications in Afghanistan. I lay in the dark with my heart hammering and told myself it was a dream, except that I had been awake when it happened. Tiffany started visiting more frequently. She always came with Julian, and she always had her phone out. And more than once I caught her filming me when she thought I wasn't looking during dinner, when I reached for the wrong glass in the living room, when I stopped mid-sentence trying to find a word that had momentarily slipped away from me. She was building something. I could feel it the way you feel weather coming in before the clouds appear. Linda Castillo called after my December checkup, and this time her voice had lost its professional ease. "Mr. Webb," she said carefully, Your cognitive scores have dropped since October. Not dramatically, but the rate of change concerns me. I want to refer you to a neurologist." "How much of a drop?" I asked. She told me. My stomach tightened. "Is there anything new in your routine?" she asked. "New medications, supplements, anything topical you've started using?" I looked at the silver tube on my bathroom shelf. "I'll think about it," I said. "Mr. Webb, I'll think about it, Linda. Thank you." I hung up and stood in the bathroom doorway for a long time staring at that tube. Then I picked it up and put it in the back of the cabinet under the sink, behind the spare towels where I would not reach for it by habit. That Friday, Austin came home for the weekend. He walked through the front door, dropped his bag, and looked at me. Really looked at me the way he had been looking at me since he was a boy who noticed things other people missed. His face did not change expression, but his eyes went very careful and very still, and I saw the exact moment he understood that something was wrong. "Dad," he said. His voice came out lower than usual, the way it did when he was trying very hard to stay calm. "When did you last sleep through the night?" I opened my mouth to answer, and I couldn't remember. Austin didn't sleep that Friday night. I know because I didn't sleep either, and at 2 in the morning I came downstairs for a glass of water and found him at the kitchen table with his laptop open and 3 different medical reference sites pulled up on the screen, a legal pad covered in handwriting beside him, and an untouched cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow. He looked up when I walked in, and the expression on his face told me everything I needed to know about how bad I looked. "Sit down, Dad," he said. Not a suggestion. I sat. He turned the legal pad toward me. He had written out my symptoms in a column: the memory gaps, the tremors, the auditory hallucinations, the cognitive score drop Linda had mentioned, and beside each one he had written a possible cause and crossed most of them out. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer me straight. When have I ever done anything else? The cream Tiffany gave you." He kept his voice level, but his pen was tapping against the table in a rapid, irregular rhythm that he didn't seem too aware of. "How long after you started using it did the symptoms begin?" I thought about it, counted back. 8 days, maybe 9. Austin wrote that down. His jaw was tight. "I switched it out," I told him. 2 weeks ago. Put it in the cabinet under the sink." He looked up sharply. "You already suspected." "I suspected something. I didn't suspect your sister specifically." That was not entirely true, but it was as much truth as I was prepared to say out loud at 2 in the morning. Austin closed his laptop. He pressed both hands flat on the table and took a long breath through his nose the way he did when he was working very hard to stay inside the boundaries of what was useful. "I need that tube," he said. "Don't touch it again. Don't let Tiffany know it's in the cabinet. Can you do that? I've kept secrets in worse conditions than this." "Dad." His voice broke slightly on the word, just at the edges before he pulled it back together. "This isn't Afghanistan. This is our kitchen. I know where we are, son." He retrieved the tube from the bathroom himself, handling it with a dish towel without touching the surface directly. He sealed it in a Ziploc bag from the kitchen drawer and labeled it with the date and time in his precise pharmacist's handwriting. The following Monday, he drove 4 hours to a private toxicology laboratory in Huntsville, far enough from Birmingham that Tiffany had no connections there, and submitted the sample under the name of his classmate and closest friend, Sophie Tran. Sophie was 26, Vietnamese-American, sharp enough to have finished her pharmacology degree a semester early, and loyal in the particular way of people who don't offer loyalty easily but mean it completely when they do. Austin called her from the parking lot of the lab. "You're sure about this?" she asked. Her voice was quiet and serious in the way it got when something mattered. "I'm not sure about anything," he said. "That's why I need the test. If this comes back the way you think it will, then we figure out what comes next, one step at a time." She agreed without another word of argument, which was one of the things Austin valued most about her. He also emailed Dr. Evelyn Park that week, the head of neurology at a Birmingham hospital, a woman he had done a research rotation under during his second year. He didn't use his real email address. He described my symptoms in clinical language, asked about possible causes for the presentation, and mentioned the timeline correlated with a new topical treatment. Dr. Park's response came back in 6 hours. "The symptom cluster you're describing is consistent with chronic low-dose organophosphate exposure. If your patient has been using a topical product, I would strongly recommend independent toxicological analysis. This is not a presentation I would attribute to natural cognitive decline." "Call me," Austin called her. His hand was shaking so hard when he dialed that he mistyped the number twice. 19 years in the Army teaches you something that no amount of civilian life can fully undo. It teaches you the difference between confusion and danger. Confusion is when you can't find your keys. Danger is when you can't find your keys and you also can't remember the last 3 hours, and your hands won't stop shaking, and the voice of a man who died in Kandahar keeps whispering through the walls at 3 in the morning. What I had been experiencing for the past 6 weeks was not confusion. I had stopped using the cream the moment I put it in the cabinet under the sink. Within 10 days, the auditory hallucinations faded. Within 2 weeks, the tremors in my hands decreased from something noticeable to something I could almost explain away as age. The memory gaps narrowed. The fog that had settled over my thinking began to lift slowly, the way ground fog burns off in the morning. Not all at once, but enough that I could see the shape of what had been done to me, and the shape of it was deliberate. I called Marcus on a Thursday morning in January when Tiffany was at a bridal consultation in Hoover and the house was quiet. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and Dorothy's phone, mine I had recently discovered, had an unfamiliar application installed on it that I did not remember downloading, the kind of thing that records calls and tracks location, and I dialed his number from memory. He picked up on the second ring. "Art." His voice was the same as it had always been, steady, like a hand on your shoulder in the dark. "Marcus," I said, "I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to listen before you say anything." "All right." I told him everything. The cream, the symptoms, the timeline, the way Tiffany had been filming me, the guardianship petition I had found reference to when I had looked up my own name in the Jefferson County probate court records 3 days earlier, a document filed in October requesting that the court declare me legally incapacitated and appoint Tiffany as my legal guardian. When I finished, Marcus was quiet for 4 full seconds. I counted. "The tube is still in the cabinet," he asked. "Austin has it. He sent a sample to a lab in Huntsville." Another pause. "Austin knows." "Austin has known longer than I have," I said. "He just hadn't told me yet." "Smart kid," Marcus said, and I could hear the tightness underneath the words, the particular compression of a man who is very angry and choosing very carefully how to hold it. "Art, listen to me. Don't touch that cream again. Don't let Tiffany know you know. Don't change anything about your routine that she would notice. I know how to run a counter-operation, Marcus." "I know you do." A breath. I just needed to say it out loud. Dorothy had come in through the back door midway through the call, the way she sometimes did when she sensed something was happening, carrying a dish of banana bread she had baked that morning. She set it on the counter without a word and sat down across from me. Her hands folded, her eyes on my face. When I hung up, she looked at me steadily. How bad? She asked. Bad enough, I said, but manageable. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her fingers were warm from the bread dish, and her grip was firm. You're not doing this alone, Arthur. I have Marcus. I have Austin. You have me too, she said. Don't forget that. I didn't say anything to that because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have embarrassed us both. But I turned my hand over and held hers for a moment, and she understood what that meant, because Dorothy Simmons had known me for 22 years, and she had always understood the things I couldn't put words to. That evening, Marcus called back. I spoke to Austin, he said. I hadn't known they had each other's numbers. Later, Austin told me he had called Marcus the same day he got Dr. Park's email before he had called me, because he wanted legal guidance before he said anything that could be used against us. My son was 28 years old, and he had already learned to think 3 moves ahead. I did not know whether to be proud of that or heartbroken by the fact that he'd had to learn it. He's sending the full lab results to Dr. Park as soon as they come in, Marcus said. I'm going to start building the legal file. Art, we need to talk about timing. Tell me. The wedding is in April. Tiffany will want this resolved before then, which means she'll push the probate petition through as fast as she can. If we move too early, we tip our hand. If we wait until the wedding. 200 witnesses, I said. 200 witnesses, Marcus confirmed. Nowhere to run. Nowhere to reframe the narrative. Everything on the record at once. He paused. It's a risk. If something goes wrong. Nothing is going to go wrong, I said. I've walked into worse situations than a wedding reception. Marcus laughed short and genuine. Yeah, he said, you have. Another pause, and when he spoke again, the lightness was gone. Art, I've owed you this for 20 years. Let me pay it back right. You don't owe me anything. I know you believe that, he said. That's why I'm going to do it anyway. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, listening to the house settle around me in the January cold. Then I heard Tiffany's car in the driveway, and I got up, put Dorothy's phone back in my pocket, and arranged my face into the expression of a man who had spent a quiet morning doing nothing in particular. It was by that point the most important performance of my life. Before I tell you what the 3 of us decided that rainy night in Marcus's kitchen, comment the number 9 below to let me know you're still here with me. I read every single one. A quick note. Parts of this story have been shaped for narrative purposes and may not reflect every detail of lived experience. If this kind of storytelling isn't for you, no hard feelings. You're welcome to step away anytime. Marcus's kitchen table had seen 30 years of case files, cold coffee, and hard decisions. The night the 3 of us sat down around it, it held all 3 at once. It was raining outside, a slow, heavy Alabama January rain that hit the windows in sheets and made the world beyond the glass disappear entirely. Inside, Marcus had a pot of coffee going and a legal pad open and a pen in his hand, and Austin sat across from me with his lab results printed out in a folder and the particular focused stillness of a man who has spent weeks being afraid and has finally found something useful to do with it. All right, Marcus said. Let's build this. He divided the work the way he had divided assignments in the field, by capability, not by preference. Austin would handle the medical evidence. Dr. Park had agreed to serve as an expert witness and would prepare a formal toxicology report certifying the presence of organophosphate compound in the cream sample. Sophie would maintain custody of the original lab results under her name, keeping them clean from any connection to our family that Tiffany's lawyers could challenge. Nurse Linda Castillo would bring Arthur's VA medical records to the wedding documentation, showing the timeline of cognitive decline beginning precisely when the cream was introduced. She'll come? I asked. I already called her, Austin said. His voice was steady, but his hands were wrapped around his coffee mug so tightly, his knuckles had gone pale. She said yes before I finished asking. Marcus would handle the legal architecture. He had already contacted a former colleague at the Alabama Attorney General's office. Based on the lab results and the video footage Austin had captured on the hidden camera, which under Alabama law was entirely legal to install in your own home without notifying visitors, Marcus would petition a circuit court judge for an emergency arrest warrant, a process that allowed law enforcement to act on credible evidence of imminent harm without waiting for a standard warrant timeline. I'll have it signed 48 hours before the wedding, Marcus said. Alabama State Police will be standing by. The moment the evidence is presented, they move. And the video? I asked. Austin set down his mug. He pulled his laptop from his bag and turned the screen toward me. I had not seen the footage before. I had known the camera was there, a small device Austin had installed behind the bookcase in my living room, angled toward the couch where Tiffany and Julian typically sat when they visited. But knowing it existed and watching it were different things. The footage was from a Thursday evening 6 weeks earlier. Tiffany was on the couch with her legs crossed, Julian beside her. Both of them relaxed in the way people are relaxed when they believe they are not being watched. Julian was saying something I couldn't make out. Then Tiffany laughed, a real laugh, not the careful one she used around me, and said clearly in the voice of someone stating a simple fact, "Just let the old man get worse. The moment that petition clears, $3 million is ours." I watched myself not react. I had spent a long time learning to not react, and the skill held even now, even watching my daughter say those words on a laptop screen in Marcus's kitchen at 11 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday night. My face stayed neutral. My breathing stayed even. But my chest felt like something inside it had been wrung out and set aside. "Dad." Austin's voice was rough. He reached across the table and put his hand on my arm. "You don't have to." "I'm all right," I said. "You don't have to be all right." "I know." I put my hand over his and held it for a moment. "I'm all right anyway." Marcus closed the laptop. He looked at both of us across the table, and in his eyes was the expression of a man who has carried a debt for 20 years and can finally see the shape of how to repay it. "We wait for the wedding," he said. "We let them believe they've won, and then we end it." He was right. It was the correct tactical decision: maximum witnesses, maximum evidence, minimum opportunity for Tiffany and Julian to reframe the narrative before it was fully public. I drove home alone through the rain. When I walked in, Tiffany was on the couch with her phone exactly where she had been in the video. She looked up and smiled. "Dad, I saved you a seat at the wedding, front row center." I set my keys on the counter and smiled back. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I said. And I meant every single word. The night before every major operation, I used to sit outside and look at the sky. It was something I had started doing in the Army without meaning to, just a habit that developed somewhere between the first deployment and the second, a way of clearing the machinery of the mind before the moment it needed to run cleanest. You look at something large enough and old enough that your own situation shrinks to its actual size. The stars don't care about your operation. That used to help. I was sitting on the porch in the March cold when Dorothy's back door opened and she came across the yard carrying something small in both hands. She was wearing her winter coat over her bathrobe, which told me she had seen my porch light on and come over without stopping to change, which was exactly the kind of thing Dorothy Simmons did. She sat down in the chair beside me and held out a small envelope. Cream-colored, slightly worn at the corners, sealed with a strip of tape that had yellowed with age. "Margaret gave me this," she said, "the week before she passed. She asked me to hold on to it until you needed it more than you needed to not read it." Dorothy's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. I think tonight is that night, Arthur. My wife had been gone for 17 years. I had not heard her name said out loud by someone who loved her in longer than I could remember, and the sound of it hit me somewhere below the rib cage in a way I was not prepared for. I took the envelope. My hands were not entirely steady. "Do you want me to go?" Dorothy asked. "No," I said. "Stay." I opened it carefully, the way you handle something that cannot be replaced. Inside was a single sheet of Margaret's stationery, pale blue with her initials at the top, in the small, precise script she had used for everything that mattered. The handwriting was hers so completely that looking at it felt like hearing her voice in a room I had thought was empty. I read it slowly. "Arthur, if you're reading this, then Dorothy decided the time was right. Which means she was probably right, because Dorothy is almost always right, and we have both always known it. I want to tell you something about our children. Tiffany came into this world with her fists closed and her jaw set, and she has never quite learned to open either. That is not your failure. You cannot teach someone to be open if they have decided that the world is something to be guarded against. You tried. I watched you try for years, and the trying itself was an act of love even when it didn't land. Austin came into this world looking around like he was already curious about what he'd find. He still does. That didn't come from nowhere, Arthur. That came from watching you. I know you will carry both of them. I know you will carry everything because that is what you do, and I loved you for it, and sometimes wanted to shake you for it in equal measure. But here is what I need you to hear. You are allowed to put some of it down. You are allowed to let the ones who love you carry something too. You have never been good at that. I am asking you from wherever I am to try. Whatever is happening tonight, and I don't know what it is, but I know you, so I know it's something. You do not have to face it the way you faced Kandahar. You don't have to be the only one running toward the fire. Let Marcus, let Austin, let Dorothy, who will absolutely be sitting next to you when you read this, pretending she isn't listening. I looked up. Dorothy was staring very hard at the middle distance with the expression of someone pretending they had not just been mentioned by name. She knew you well, I said. Dorothy pressed her lips together tightly. Her chin was trembling. She knew everybody well, she said, and her voice came out smaller than usual, scraped thin by something she was working hard to hold back. She was the smartest woman I ever met, and I have met a lot of women. I folded the letter and held it for a moment. Then I reached up and put it in the breast pocket of my jacket, directly over my heart, where I intended to keep it for the next 24 hours. I'm going to be all right, Dot, I said. I know you are. She reached over and gripped my arm with both hands, her fingers digging in with a fierceness that surprised me. Her voice came out rough and fierce and full of 17 years of missing my wife and 22 years of being my neighbor and everything that meant. But you're going to be all right because of the people standing next to you, not instead of them. You understand me. I understand you. Good. She released my arm and sat back and pulled her coat tighter around herself. Now stop looking at the sky and go to bed. You have a wedding to go to tomorrow, and you look like you haven't slept properly in 3 months. I haven't slept properly in 3 months. I know, she said. That's why I said it. I almost smiled. It was the closest I had come to smiling in a while, and it felt strange on my face, like a muscle remembering how to do something it had nearly forgotten. I went inside. I checked the locks, turned off the lights, and lay down on my bed with Margaret's letter still in my jacket pocket, still pressed against my chest. I thought about fire. I thought about Kandahar and the burning house on Callaway Road and the 200 people who would be sitting in the Grand Hotel ballroom in Birmingham tomorrow evening, none of them knowing what was about to happen in that room. I thought about Tiffany standing in the snow at 12 years old, looking at my burns and saying nothing. I thought about Austin sitting up until 2 in the morning with a legal pad and 3 medical websites and cold coffee trying to save me the way I had once tried to save everyone else. Then I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 3 months I slept. The Grand Hotel looked exactly the way Tiffany had always wanted her life to look. Crystal chandeliers throwing light across white orchids and pressed linen. 200 guests in evening wear moving through a room that had been designed to make ordinary people feel like they had arrived somewhere that mattered. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when someone has spent a great deal of money ensuring that nothing real gets through. I had dressed carefully. Dark suit, white shirt, and for the first time in years, I left the top button unfastened. Not enough for anyone to notice. Just enough that I could feel the air on my neck, on the scarring on the skin that had never quite gone back to normal. A small private decision that had taken me 73 years to make. Margaret's letter was in my breast pocket. I touched it once through the fabric of my jacket as I walked through the front entrance, and then I kept walking. Austin was waiting for me near the coat check. He was wearing a dark gray suit that he had clearly purchased specifically for this occasion and was not entirely comfortable in, and when he saw me coming through the doors, his shoulders dropped about half an inch with relief. "Everything's in place," he said quietly, falling into step beside me. "Marcus is already inside. Kowalski came in through the side entrance 20 minutes ago. Linda has the VA records. Sophie has the lab file on her laptop. Dr. Park, seated at table 9. She knows what to do." I nodded. We walked through the lobby together, past the floral arrangements and the card table with the seating chart, past the string quartet, playing something classical near the entrance to the ballroom. "Dad." Austin stopped walking. He turned to face me, and his expression did something complicated, the face of a young man trying to hold too many emotions in a container that wasn't quite big enough for all of them. His eyes were bright, and his jaw was set, and his voice when it came was lower than usual. "Whatever happens tonight, you know I'm right here. The whole time. Right here." I put my hand on his shoulder. "I know, son. I mean it. I know you mean it. That's why I said I know." He breathed out hard through his nose, something between a laugh and the kind of exhale that happens when you've been holding your breath for 3 months. Then he straightened his jacket, and we went in. The ballroom was already full. I found my seat at the front table, the one Tiffany had assigned me, center position, directly in front of the stage, exactly where the lighting would find me most easily. I understood the placement differently now than I had when she'd told me about it. Dorothy was 2 tables back, in a deep blue dress she had clearly bought for the occasion, sitting with Pastor Gerald Webb, who had married Margaret and me 38 years ago, in a small church on the south side of Birmingham, who had baptized both Tiffany and Austin, and who had called me 3 days ago to say he had heard some things and wanted to be there tonight. He caught my eye across the room and gave me a single small nod. I nodded back. Marcus was near the far wall, standing with Ray Kowalski. Both of them had the contained, watchful stillness of men who had spent their lives waiting for the right moment. Kowalski had his hands in his pockets and was scanning the room the way you scan a room when you've been trained to know where all the exits are. Marcus had a glass of water he wasn't drinking. Near the stage, Julian stood with a group of men I didn't recognize, laughing at something with the easy confidence of a man who believes the evening is already won. Tiffany moved through the room in her wedding dress, stopping at tables, touching shoulders, receiving compliments with a grace that would have been genuinely lovely if I hadn't known what was underneath it. She looked up once and found me at the front table. She smiled. It was a full, warm, deliberate smile, and it lasted exactly long enough to make her point. I smiled back. Austin leaned close beside me. You doing okay? I reached up and touched the breast pocket of my jacket, feeling the slight weight of Margaret's letter beneath my fingers. Yes, I said. I really am. Then the lights went out. The spotlight had found me the moment the lights went out. I described that already, and you already know what it felt like. What I did not describe because I did not have the words for it yet was what was happening inside while the light held me there. My hands were flat on the tablecloth. My breathing was controlled. My face was neutral. And underneath all of that, in the place where the army had taught me to keep the things that couldn't show, I was doing the only calculation that had ever mattered in a dangerous situation. I was counting what I had, and I was counting what they didn't know I had, because moving would have looked like running, and I had never run from anything in my life that I was proud of running from. The LED screen behind the stage blazed to life. My face filled it. 20 feet across, lit from the worst possible angle, every line and fold and ruin of the scarring along my neck and jaw magnified to the size of something you'd see at a drive-in movie theater. I heard the sound move through the room, not quite a gasp, not quite a murmur, something between the two, the involuntary noise 200 people make when they see something they were not prepared to see. Tiffany's voice came through the speakers, smooth and sorrowful, and practiced down to the last syllable. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to take a moment before we begin our celebration to address something I have carried alone for too long. She paused, letting the silence do its work. The man you see on this screen is my father. And for years, I have watched his mental state deteriorate to the point where his presence in our levees has become difficult. Dangerous, even. Tonight, with the support of my husband and this community, I'm taking the necessary step of arranging for his transfer to a specialized memory care facility. A woman somewhere to my left made a sound like she'd been struck. A man near the back said loudly enough to carry, "What on earth?" Julian stood at the edge of the stage with his arms folded, and a look on his face that I recognized from the first dinner. From every moment I had spent in the same room with him. The look of a man watching an investment pay out. I kept my face still. I kept my breathing even. I reached up slowly and touched the breast pocket of my jacket, felt the slight weight of Margaret's letter beneath my fingers, and I thought, not yet. Not yet. Let her finish. Let her show everyone exactly who she is. Tiffany was still speaking. Something about the burden of caregiving. Something about the difficult decisions families face. Her voice had taken on the particular tremor of performed grief, the kind that sounds like emotion and contains none. Then Austin stood up. His chair went back hard enough that it hit the table behind him, and the crash of it cut through Tiffany's speech like a blade. Every head in the room turned. Tiffany. His voice came out raw and furious, and completely certain, the voice of a man who has been holding something back for months, and has finally reached the moment when holding it back is no longer possible. Stop talking. Tiffany looked at him the way she had always looked at him, when he contradicted her with the patient condescension of someone who believes they are the only adult in the room. Austin, sit down. This doesn't it concerns me. He stepped out from behind the table and moved toward the stage, his jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle working in his cheek. You want to stand up there and tell 200 people that our father is losing his mind. Go ahead. You explain to them how a man losing his mind managed to run into a burning building twice. You explain to them what his back looks like and why. Julian made a small gesture toward the back of the room. 2 security guards in black suits began threading through the tables toward Austin. The first one reached him and put a hand on his arm. Austin pulled free, a sharp, clean movement, Not aggressive, purely defensive, the instinct of a man protecting his space. The guard grabbed for him again, and this time Austin stepped back directly in front of me, planting himself between the guard and his father, his arms slightly out from his sides. I recognized the stance. He had stood the same way at 7 years old outside a burning house, his small arms spread wide as if the sheer determination to protect could substitute for size. Some things do not change. "Don't," Austin said to the guard. One word, flat and final, the kind of word that closes a door. The guard stopped. Julian's face had gone tight with irritation. He stepped forward from the stage and opened his mouth to say something, and that was when the back doors of the ballroom opened. Not one door. Both of them simultaneously with the kind of coordinated precision that does not happen by accident. I heard the radio crackle first, a burst of static from somewhere near the entrance that cut through the noise of the room like a knife through silk. Then I saw the uniforms. Alabama State Police, 4 of them moving into position at the perimeter of the room, with the calm efficiency of people who know exactly where they are going and exactly what they have been authorized to do. Behind them walked Marcus. He moved down the center aisle, without hurrying, without looking at the crowd or the stage or the enormous screen that still held my face. He walked the way he had always walked when the situation was serious, like a man who has already decided how this ends and is simply arriving at the conclusion. In his right hand was a black envelope. He stopped at the foot of the stage and looked up at Tiffany, and the expression on his face was not anger. It was something quieter and more permanent than anger. It was the face of a man settling a 20-year debt. "Step back from the microphone," Marcus said. His voice carried to every corner of that room without effort, without a speaker, without anything except 70 years of knowing how to be heard when it mattered. "We're going to do something different now." Tiffany's hand tightened on the microphone. Her knuckles went white, and for the first time all evening, she did not have an answer ready. Before I tell you what Marcus put on that screen, the thing that made 200 people go completely still, drop "I'm here" in the comments. I want to know you made it this far. A note before we continue: some elements of this story have been crafted for narrative and educational purposes. If this type of content isn't what you're looking for, you're welcome to step away, and I'll see you in a different story. Marcus had a saying he used in every courtroom he had ever walked into. The truth presented in the right order doesn't need to argue. It only needs to be seen. He had told me that the night we sat around his kitchen table in January, and I had thought about it many times since. Standing in that spotlight, watching him climb the steps to the stage with the black envelope in his hand. I finally understood what he meant. He didn't rush. He didn't have to. The Alabama State Police officers had taken up positions at every exit of the ballroom. 4 of them quiet and deliberate, their presence alone enough to tell every person in the room that what was happening was not a family dispute that could be walked away from. Julian had turned toward the nearest exit and found a uniformed officer standing in front of it, with his hands clasped behind his back. The color left Julian's face in a single visible wave, starting at his forehead and moving downward. Tiffany still had the microphone. Her knuckles were white around it, and her jaw was set, but something behind her eyes had shifted, the particular shift that happens when a person realizes the script they memorized is no longer the script being performed. Marcus set the black envelope on the podium. He produced a laptop from the bag over his shoulder and connected it to the hotel's projection system with the practiced efficiency of a man who had prepared for this moment many times in his imagination, and once in a parking garage in Hoover, 2 weeks earlier, testing the connection with Austin, while Sophie Tran sat in the car running the timer. The LED screen behind him changed. Where my face had been, there was now a document. Official letterhead, Jefferson County Fire Marshal's Office. Date December 15, 2010. My name is Marcus Reeves, Marcus said into the microphone. His voice was unhurried and clear. I spent 14 years as a law enforcement officer in the state of Alabama and 20 years as a criminal defense attorney. I am also the man whose life Arthur Webb saved in Kandahar, Afghanistan, in the autumn of 2004. Kowalski, seated 2 tables from the front, straightened in his chair. His jaw tightened. He had known this moment was coming, and knowing it hadn't made it any easier to sit through. The document on the screen behind me, Marcus continued, is the official incident report filed by the Jefferson County Fire Marshal following a residential fire at the Webb family home on Callaway Road on the night of December 14, 2010. He paused, letting the room absorb the date. This report documents, among other things, the injuries sustained by Arthur Webb during that fire. He looked directly at Tiffany. Specifically, third-degree burns covering the posterior neck and left shoulder sustained when Mr. Webb used his body to shield his daughter from a falling structural beam. Marcus let that land. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The daughter is 37 years old today. She has no burn scars. She has a face that has never been touched by fire. She stood on this stage 20 minutes ago and called her father a monster because of what his neck looks like. The room erupted, not into applause, into something rawer than that. The sound of 200 people processing a piece of information that had rearranged something fundamental. A woman in the 3rd row pressed both hands over her mouth, her eyes filling fast. An older man near the back, I recognized him as one of Julian's business associates. Someone who had been smiling and relaxed 20 minutes ago had gone very still, staring at the document on the screen, with an expression that had curdled from confusion into something colder. Nurse Linda Castillo appeared from the left side of the room. She was in her 50s, compact and precise in the way of people who spent their professional lives paying close attention to details that other people missed. She carried a manila folder in both hands, Arthur's VA Medical Center records, documenting the timeline of his appointments, his cognitive assessments, his declining scores beginning in November 2024. She handed the folder to Marcus without a word. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second, and the look that passed between them was the look of 2 people who have done what they came to do. Marcus opened the folder. This one, he said, is Mr. Webb's medical record from the Birmingham 5A Medical Center. What it shows is a pattern of cognitive decline beginning in the 2nd week of November 2024, coinciding precisely with the introduction of a topical product given to Mr. Webb by his daughter as a gift. He looked up. A gift that, as we will demonstrate momentarily, contained a substance that had no business being in a skin cream. Julian moved. Not toward an exit, the exits were covered, but sideways, a small, instinctive repositioning the body, reacting to danger before the mind had fully processed it. One of the state police officers tracked the movement with his eyes and took a single step forward. Julian stopped. Pastor Gerald Webb had been sitting in the 2nd row with his hands folded in his lap and his face composed in the expression of a man who had officiated at funerals and weddings and everything in between and had learned to hold space for whatever came. But as Marcus spoke, something in the pastor's composure had changed. His shoulders had come forward. His hands had unfolded. He was leaning toward the stage with the focused attention of a man hearing a sermon that was costing him something to hear. He looked at me across the room. I looked back at him. "Arthur," he said quietly enough that only the people nearest to him could hear. I shook my head slightly. "Not yet." He nodded and folded his hands again and waited. Marcus placed the fire marshal's report and the VA records side by side on the podium. Then he reached into the black envelope one final time and removed a USB drive. He held it up where the room could see it. The third piece of evidence, he said, is video. Tiffany's hand tightened on the microphone so hard that I heard the housing creak. It was recorded in Mr. Webb's home, Marcus continued, on a device installed by his son Austin in a location clearly within the private property of the homeowner. Under Alabama law, a homeowner may record audio and video within their own residence without notifying visitors. The footage is entirely admissible. He looked at Julian. I want to make sure everyone understands that before we watch it. Julian's mouth opened. Then it closed. He looked at Tiffany. Tiffany looked straight ahead at the screen, her jaw working, her eyes bright with something that had moved past fear into the territory beyond it. Marcus inserted the USB drive into the laptop. 200 witnesses, he said quietly, almost to himself. Then he pressed play. The first thing you heard on the video was laughter. Not the careful, constructed kind that Tiffany used in public. The real kind, loose and unguarded, the laugh of a person who believes completely that no one is listening. It filled the ballroom through the speakers, and the contrast between that sound and the silence of 200 people holding their breath was something I will never fully be able to describe. The footage was from the living room of my house, the bookcase in the corner, the couch where Tiffany and Julian always sat. The timestamp in the bottom right corner read November 18th, 2024, 1 week after the cream had arrived in its white box with the gold ribbon. Julian's voice came first, low and satisfied. How's he doing? Tiffany's voice, relaxed, comfortable, the voice she used when she thought she was safe. Better than expected. Linda called him after the last appointment. He's worried. Good. The sound of ice in a glass. Worried is good. Worried means he's noticing but not understanding. He won't understand. A pause. The soft sound of her settling back against the cushions. He's getting worse every week. By the time the petition clears, he won't be able to challenge anything. Julian laughed again. $3 million. And the land, Tiffany said. Don't forget the land. I never forget the land. Another pause. Then Tiffany's voice, lighter now, almost amused. Just let the old man get worse. The moment that petition clears, it's all ours. The video ended. The room did not make a sound for what felt like a very long time. Then a woman in the fourth row, one of Tiffany's friends from college, someone who had been smiling and leaning forward in her seat an hour ago, put her face in her hands and began to cry. Not quietly. The kind of crying that happens when something you believed about a person collapses all at once, and the grief of it has nowhere else to go. It started something. One by one, the sounds of the room returned, not celebration, not anger exactly, but the low, terrible murmur of people revising everything they thought they knew. Austin was standing 2 feet to my left. I felt him before I saw him, the particular stillness that had come over him, the held breath quality of someone who has spent months working toward a single moment and is now standing inside it and doesn't quite know what to do with their hands. His jaw was clenched. His eyes were fixed on the screen. And then very slowly, he exhaled a long, shaking breath that he had been holding, I realized, since November. Sophie Tron appeared from the right side of the stage. She was 26 years old and moved with the focused precision of someone who had a job to do and intended to do it correctly. She plugged a second USB drive into the laptop and looked at Marcus, who nodded once. The screen changed. A new document appeared, laboratory letterhead, Huntsville Toxicology Associates, dated December 28th, 2024. Dense with clinical language, but the key finding was rendered in bold at the top of the second page, large enough for the front rows to read without assistance. Organophosphate compound detected. Concentration, chronic low-dose exposure range. Source material, topical cream sample. Dr. Evelyn Park stood up from table 9. She was 45 with the composed bearing of someone who had spent 2 decades delivering difficult information to people who did not want to hear it. She walked to the base of the stage and addressed the room directly without a microphone, in the clear, carrying voice of a person accustomed to being heard in large spaces. "I am Dr. Evelyn Park, head of neurology at Birmingham Medical Center," she said. "I reviewed this toxicology report in consultation with the laboratory that produced it. The compound identified is consistent with a class of chemicals that at chronic low doses delivered transdermally through the skin produces a symptom cluster mimicking early-stage dementia, memory disruption, tremors, perceptual disturbances." She looked around the room. "These are not symptoms of aging. They are symptoms of poisoning." Julian's hands had stopped moving. He was standing completely rigid, his arms at his sides, staring at Dr. Park with the expression of a man watching a wall fall toward him and understanding too late that he had built it himself. Kowalski stood up from his table. He was 65 years old and built like a man who had never entirely stopped being a soldier, and when he rose to his full height, the people on either side of him instinctively leaned away. He did not go to the stage. He simply stood where he was and spoke in a voice that required no amplification whatsoever. "I was there," he said. "Kandahar, autumn of 2004. I watched Arthur Webb run into a vehicle that was on fire and pull 3 men out of it before it went up completely." He looked around the room, slowly making sure he had everyone. "The burns on his neck and back from that day are one thing. The burns he got 6 years later in his own house saving the woman standing on that stage, those are something else." His voice dropped half a register into something that was almost quiet. "She walked out of that house without a mark on her. I was there for that too." He sat back down. The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. Those had been shocked silences, reactive silences, the silence of people being surprised. This one was the silence of a room that had reached a conclusion and was sitting with the weight of it. Tiffany had not moved. She was still holding the microphone, but her arm had dropped so that it hung at her side, the mic pointed at the floor. Her face had done something I had not seen it do since she was 12 years old, standing in the snow outside our burning house. It had stopped performing. Underneath the stopped performance was something raw and very young and very frightened, and looking at it hurt me in a way I had not expected to be hurt. She was still my daughter. That was the thing about love that nobody warned you about sufficiently. It didn't stop when the person stopped deserving it. It just changed shape, and the new shape was sometimes harder to carry than the old one. Julian looked at Tiffany. Tiffany looked at Julian. And in that single exchanged glance, the glance of two people who have built something together and are watching it come apart, I saw the exact moment when each of them understood that whatever they had been to each other was over. Sophie quietly removed the USB drives from the laptop and placed them in a sealed evidence bag she had been carrying in the inside pocket of her jacket. She handed the bag to the nearest state police officer without being asked. Her hands were steady. Austin watched her do it, and something crossed his face, gratitude so complete. It had moved past expression into something quieter. The look of a person realizing that the right people had shown up when it mattered. Marcus turned from the laptop and looked at me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just nodded once, the way soldiers do when a thing has been done that needed doing, and stepped back from the podium. I had not planned to speak. That is the truth. And I want to be clear about it, because what happened next has been described to me afterward by people who were there as though I had orchestrated it, as though I had planned every step of it, the way Marcus had planned the legal architecture and Austin had planned the evidence chain. I had not. When Marcus stepped back from the podium and looked at me, I had no speech prepared. I had no plan. I had a letter in my breast pocket and 73 years of living and the particular knowledge learned in places where it costs something to learn that some moments cannot be prepared for. They can only be entered. I stood up. Austin reached for my arm. "Dad." "I'm all right," I said. "You don't have to." "I know." I looked at him. His eyes were red, and his jaw was working, and he had the expression of a young man who has spent months being strong and is running very close to the end of what that costs. I put my hand on his face for just a moment, the way I had when he was small, when the world had frightened him, and I needed him to know I was still there. "I know I don't have to. That's why I'm going to." I walked to the stage. The spotlight was still on. It found me as I climbed the steps, and I did not flinch away from it the way I had when it had first come on an hour ago. An hour ago, the light had been a weapon. Now it was just light. I had been standing in worse things than light for most of my life. Marcus held out the microphone. I took it. I stood at the podium and looked out at 200 people, and I let the room be quiet for a moment, because the room needed that, and because I needed it too. I reached up and touched the breast pocket of my jacket, felt the slight weight of Margaret's letter beneath the fabric, and then I lowered my hand and looked at my daughter. Tiffany was still on the stage. She had not moved since the video ended. She was standing 10 feet away from me, with the microphone hanging at her side, and her face doing the thing it had done since she was 12 years old, trying to be unreadable, trying to be closed, trying to present a surface that nothing could get through. She almost managed it. Almost. "Tiffany," I said. Her chin moved. Barely. But it moved. "I'm not going to tell this room things they don't already know," I said. "Marcus has done that. The documents have done that. The video has done that." I paused. "I'm going to tell them one thing that isn't in any document." The room was completely still. 51 years ago, I enlisted in the United States Army because I believed that when someone needed help, someone had to be willing to go to them. My voice was steady. I had not expected it to be steady, but it was the way your hands are steady when you have practiced something long enough that the body takes over from the mind. That belief took me to Afghanistan. It took me into a burning vehicle in Kandahar to pull out 3 men, one of whom is standing in this room tonight. It took me up a staircase in my own house on a December night in 2010 into a room where the ceiling was coming down because my daughter was on the other side of a door that was too hot to touch. I looked at Tiffany. "I used my back," I said. "My neck. The parts of me that were closest to the beam. I didn't think about it. I didn't calculate it. You were there, and the beam was falling, and there was only one thing to do." Tiffany's free hand had come up to her collarbone. Her fingers pressed against it hard, as though she was checking for something. Her eyes were bright with tears she was refusing to shed, and her jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscle jumping in her cheek. "For 15 years," I continued. I told myself that what happened afterward, the silence, the distance, the shame you seem to feel about what I look like. I told myself it was something I had done wrong, something I had failed to teach you, or failed to show you, or failed to be. I stopped. I was wrong about that. I know that now. Some things are not the father's failure. Some things are the child's choice. The room made a sound. Not words, just the involuntary sound of collective exhale, 200 people releasing something they had been holding. "I am not angry," I said. "I want everyone in this room to understand that. I am not standing up here because I am angry. I am standing up here because I spent 19 years running toward things that needed to be faced, and I am not going to stop doing that now just because the thing that needs facing is my own daughter." I looked away from Tiffany then. I looked at Austin standing at the foot of the stage with his arms at his sides, and tears running freely down his face that he was making no attempt to stop or hide. "I was also given a son," I said, "who rode his bicycle to a library on a Saturday morning when he was 12 years old to look up treatments for scar tissue because he had decided without being asked that his father's pain was something he was going to spend his life trying to reduce." My voice caught for the first time. Just once, just briefly before I pulled it back. I did not raise a perfect family, but I raised that boy. And that is enough. That is more than enough. Austin put both hands over his face. Pastor Gerald Webb stood up. He was 70 years old, and he rose with the careful deliberateness of a large man who has learned to move through the world gently. He walked to the stage without hurrying, climbed the steps, and came to stand beside me. He placed his right hand on my left shoulder, the scarred one, the one that had never fully recovered from either fire, and he held it there with a firmness that said, "I know what this shoulder has carried. I am not afraid of it." He turned to face the room. "I have known this man for 38 years, Pastor Webb said. His voice was the voice of someone who had spoken at more funerals and more weddings than he could count, and it carried to every corner of the ballroom without effort. I married him and Margaret in a church on the south side of Birmingham. I held both of his children when they were baptized. I have watched him lose his wife and raise those children alone and serve this country and come home changed in the ways that service changes a man." He looked at Tiffany. "This man did not raise a monster," he said. "He raised a daughter who chose to become one." He let that settle for exactly one breath. There is a difference, and everyone in this room knows it, and God sees it. The first person to stand was the older gentleman in the Korean War veteran cap, 2 tables from the front. He rose slowly, the way old men rise when their knees make it a deliberate act, and he began to clap. Then the woman in the 4th row, the one who had been crying, stood up and clapped too. Then the table behind her. Then the table beside them. Within 30 seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet. I stood at the podium and let it happen around me, and I did not perform gratitude or relief or triumph. I just stood there with Margaret's letter over my heart, and my son's tears on his face, and my oldest friend's hand on my ruined shoulder. And I let the room be what it was. Tiffany had gone very still. She was not clapping. She was not moving. She was standing in the middle of a standing ovation for the man she had tried to destroy, and the expression on her face had traveled past fear and past calculation and had arrived somewhere I had not seen it go before. It looked for the first time in 37 years like the beginning of understanding. The sound of handcuffs is something you never quite forget. I had heard it many times over the years, in the field, in processing centers, in the corridors of the VA hospital, where sometimes men came in who needed more help than medicine could give them. It is a clean sound. Final in a way that few sounds are. A small mechanical click that says this part of the story is over. Whatever comes next is a different story. The Alabama State Police officers moved with the quiet efficiency of people executing a plan that had been made carefully and well in advance. The lead officer climbed the stage steps and addressed Julian first, which was the correct order. Julian was the one who had sourced the compound, and the warrant named him as the primary suspect. Julian did not wait to be asked. It was her idea. His voice came out fast and flat, stripped of all the polish he had spent years applying to it. He pointed at Tiffany with one finger, the gesture of a fella throwing cargo overboard to keep his own boat afloat. All of it. The cream, the petition, the plan. I told her it was too far. I told her we should find another way. She wouldn't listen. The room made a sound like a single sharp intake of breath. Tiffany turned to look at Julian with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not fear, but something colder and more final than either. the expression of a person watching the last wall come down and understanding in one complete and terrible moment that they built every single one of them themselves. "Julian," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Don't. I'm sorry." He was not looking at her anymore. He was looking at the officer. "I'll cooperate fully. Whatever you need." The officer nodded and produced the handcuffs, and the click of them closing around Julian's wrists was exactly the sound I remembered, clean and final, and oddly quiet for something that meant so much. Tiffany watched them lead Julian toward the exit. Her eyes followed him all the way to the door, and then he was gone, and she was still standing on the stage with a microphone in her hand that she had forgotten she was holding. The second officer approached her. She didn't run. I want to say that clearly because some part of me had been afraid she would make it worse in that final moment by doing something that couldn't be taken back. She didn't. She set the microphone down on the podium with a careful, deliberate movement, the most deliberate thing I had seen her do all evening, and she held out her wrists, the handcuffs closed. And then she looked at me. I had thought I was prepared for that moment. I had spent 4 months building toward it, planning it, surviving the days between then and now by reminding myself that it was coming, that the truth was coming, that the people responsible for what had been done to me would face what they had done. I had been prepared for a lot of things. I had not been prepared for how young she would look. She was 37 years old, and she was being escorted off a stage in handcuffs at her own wedding reception, and underneath all of it, underneath the plan and the cruelty and the months of calculated damage, she looked like a child who had made a decision so large that the consequences of it had only just become real to her. Her chin was trembling. Her eyes were full of tears that had finally, after hours of refusal, begun to fall. "Dad," she said. One word, raw and small in a way her voice had not been since she was 12 years old, since the last time she had needed something from me badly enough to ask for it honestly. Pastor Webb appeared at my left side. He had come down from the stage and crossed the room without my noticing, and now he was simply there, the way he had always been, simply there at the moments that mattered. He put his hand briefly on my arm, not saying anything, just present. Dorothy appeared at my right. She had pushed through from her table, and her eyes were red, and her chin was doing the same thing Tiffany's was doing, that involuntary trembling of a person holding something very large very carefully, and she reached over and took my hand and held it. I looked at my daughter, being walked toward the exit of a room that had 1 hour ago been decorated for the happiest day of her life. I breathed. "Tiffany," I said. She stopped. The officer beside her waited. "I forgive you." My voice came out steady. I had not planned those words either, but they were true and they needed to be said in front of everyone the same way the harm had been done in front of everyone. I want you to know that. Whatever comes next, whatever the courts decide, whatever your life looks like on the other side of this, I forgive you. Her face broke open. Not partially, completely, the way a face breaks when the thing it has been braced against finally arrives. A sound came out of her that was not a word, just grief in its most stripped-down form, and her shoulders shook once hard before she pulled them back. "But I need you to understand something," I continued. "Forgiveness is not the same thing as trust, and trust is not something I can give you because you are crying. Trust is something that is built slowly over a long time by people who do what they say and say what they mean." I paused. "I don't know if we will ever get there. I hope we do, but I cannot promise you that we will." Pastor Webb's hand tightened briefly on my arm. Tiffany nodded. It was a small nod, barely visible, but it was honest in a way that almost nothing she had done that evening had been honest. She was still crying. She didn't try to stop. They walked her out through the same doors she had walked in through 3 hours ago when she had believed the night would end very differently. The ballroom was very quiet. Then Dorothy squeezed my hand so hard it hurt, which was exactly what I needed, and she said in the voice of a woman who has earned the right to say exactly what she thinks, "Margaret would be proud of you." Absolutely furious about the occasion, but proud. I laughed. It came out of nowhere, and it was real, and it felt like something unlocking in my chest that had been locked for a very long time. Austin appeared from somewhere and put his arm around my shoulders from one side, and Dorothy held my hand from the other, and Kowalski materialized behind me and put his large hand briefly on the back of my neck, on the scars, without hesitation, the way soldiers touch each other when words are insufficient. Pastor Webb looked at the room at 200 people standing in a ballroom that had been through something none of them had expected, and he said quietly, without a microphone, "I think we could all use something to eat." Someone laughed. Then someone else, then the whole room, tentative at first, and then genuinely the laughter of people who have been through something hard together and have found on the other side of it that they are still standing. The catering staff began moving. 3 months later, I sat in a courtroom in Jefferson County and watched justice arrive the way it usually does, not with drama, not with ceremony, but with paperwork and fluorescent lighting, and a judge who had clearly seen worse things than this and was not going to pretend otherwise. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. After the Grand Hotel ballroom, after 200 people and crystal chandeliers, and a 20-foot LED screen, I had somehow imagined that the formal conclusion of everything would require a grander stage. It doesn't. Justice, I have learned, doesn't need grand stages. It needs the right people in the right room with the right documents. Marcus sat beside me. He had worn his best suit, dark charcoal, the one I had only seen him wear at funerals and significant trials, and he held a legal pad on his knee that he hadn't written anything on since the proceedings began because there was nothing left to write. The work had been done. This was the accounting. Austin was on my other side. He had his hands folded on the table in front of him, and his back very straight, and he was watching the proceedings with the focused attention of someone who has earned the right to see this through to the end. Julian entered first. He looked smaller than he had at the wedding. The tailored suit had been replaced by something off the rack, and the tan from the golf courses had faded in 3 months of indoor living, and the easy confidence that had been his most consistent feature was simply gone, replaced by the particular careful blankness of a man managing his exposure. He had retained a private attorney, which was his right, and that attorney had negotiated what attorneys negotiate when the evidence is overwhelming and the client is willing to cooperate. The judge reviewed the plea agreement without visible emotion. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "you have agreed to plead guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse and 1 count of conspiracy to commit first-degree assault under Alabama Code Sections 38-9-7 and 13-A-6-20. In exchange for your cooperation and testimony, the state has agreed to recommend a sentence of 20 years with the possibility of parole after serving 85%. She looked up from the document. "Do you understand the terms of this agreement?" "Yes, Your Honor," Julian said. His voice was flat. The Polish was entirely gone. "And you affirm that your cooperation includes full disclosure of your role in the procurement of the compound used in this case?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Very well. The procurement, as Marcus had explained to me afterward, had involved an online black market network, the kind that operates in the spaces between legal oversight and human decency. The compound itself was classified as a restricted agricultural chemical in 3 states. Julian had sourced it 6 weeks before the wedding. 20 years. The words landed in the courtroom the way large things land, with a weight that is felt more than heard. I watched Julian's attorney place a hand briefly on his client's arm, and I watched Julian not react to it, sitting completely still with his eyes on the table in front of him. And I thought, this is what it looks like when a man runs out of moves. Tiffany entered separately. She looked different from the woman who had stood on that stage 3 months ago. The careful performance of herself had been set aside, not removed entirely, because some habits run too deep to simply stop, but set aside the way you set aside something you have been carrying for too long and are finally willing to put down. Her hair was pulled back simply. She wore no jewelry. She walked to her seat without looking around the room, and when she sat down, she folded her hands in her lap and looked at the judge and did not look at me. Her attorney had negotiated separately from Julian's, which told me everything I needed to know about how their relationship had ended. The judge reviewed her case. The charges were the same as Julian's, but Tiffany's cooperation had been more limited. She had confirmed the facts rather than elaborating on them, which was a distinction her attorney had worked hard to establish. Ms. Webb-Mercer, the judge said, the court finds sufficient basis to accept your guilty plea, given the aggravating nature of the offense, specifically that the victim was your own parent, an elderly veteran, and that the scheme involved sustained deception over a period of several months. The court is inclined to sentence toward the higher end of the agreed range. She paused. 12 years with the possibility of parole after serving 70%. Tiffany's shoulders rose and fell once a single controlled breath. Then she said, "Yes, Your Honor," in a voice that was quiet and clear and had nothing performed about it. 12 years. Marcus leaned close to me and said very quietly, "Alabama Slayer rule applies automatically. Given her conviction for financial exploitation of the grantor, she is legally prohibited from receiving any benefit under the trust instrument. The court will confirm it in the order, but it's settled." I nodded. The trust, the land, all of it beyond her reach now, not because I had taken it from her, but because the law recognized that a person who harms the one who created something for them forfeits the right to benefit from it. There was a certain clean logic to that, which I had always appreciated about the law when it worked the way it was supposed to. After the sentencing, Marcus filed the paperwork to transfer the trust to Austin. It took 11 minutes. $3 million and the parcel on the east side of town, the one that had been in my family for 3 generations, the one that Julian had known about before the first dinner and had coveted ever since. Austin received it without ceremony. He signed the documents at a table in the hallway outside the courtroom with Marcus's pen, and when it was done, he sat very still for a moment, with the pen still in his hand. "You know what I want to do with it," he said. "I know," I told him. "I want to make sure you're all right with it. All of it." I looked at my son, this serious, careful young man who had ridden his bicycle to the library at 12 years old and had never stopped moving toward the things that needed doing. "Use it," I said. "All of it. Every dollar. Build something that lasts." He nodded. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were bright, and he looked in that moment so much like his mother that it took my breath away for a second before it came back. The center would be called the Arthur Webb Healing Center, free treatment for veterans and severe burn survivors, in partnership with the Birmingham FAO Medical Center and Dr. Evelyn Park's Neurology Department. Austin had been planning the structure for months, working with Nurse Linda on the clinical model and with Sophie on the pharmaceutical research component. He told me the name in the hallway quietly, the way you tell someone something you have been holding carefully. I had to sit down. Not because my legs gave out, they didn't, but because some things require sitting down to receive properly, and this was one of them. I sat on a wooden bench in the hallway of the Jefferson County Courthouse, and my son stood in front of me, and I pressed both hands over my eyes, and I let myself feel the full weight of it, not just the center, not just the name, but all of it. Everything that had been done to me, and everything that had been done for me, and everything that was going to grow out of both of those things. Austin sat down beside me. He didn't say anything. He just put his arm around my shoulders and held on. We sat like that for a while in the hallway of a courthouse on a Tuesday in July. Two men who had been through a fire together, more than one fire, in more than one sense, and had come out the other side of it still standing. On the way out, a young man in a wheelchair held the door open for me. He had burn scars on both forearms, old ones, the kind that had been there long enough to have settled into the skin and become part of the landscape of a person. He looked at my neck, then at my face. He didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. He nodded the small, complete nod that passes between people who share a particular knowledge of what fire costs, and I nodded back. I thought that is who this is for. I thought that is who it has always been for. 6 months after the wedding, I wore a short-sleeved shirt outside for the first time in 11 years. No mirror speech. No moment of reckoning. I reached into the closet, pulled out a shirt, put it on, and walked out the back door into the October sun. The scars on my neck and arms caught the afternoon light, without anything to filter them. That was simply what happened when you stopped hiding. Some decisions feel enormous while you make them. Others turn out to be ordinary the moment they're done. This one was the second kind. Austin was at the grill in the apron Dorothy had given him. King of the backyard, the letters already peeling, doing something to a rack of ribs that produced a significant amount of smoke, and a confidence I found difficult to share. He looked up when I came through the door. His eyes moved to my arms, my neck, the scars in the light. He didn't comment. He just grinned wide and real and all the way to his eyes and said, "I'm trying something new with the dry rub." "You've been trying something new with the dry rub for 3 years. One of these days it's going to work." "I believe in you," I told him. "I have very low confidence in the ribs." He laughed, and the sound went up into the Alabama oaks and disappeared, and I stood there and let myself feel how ordinary it was, how completely, wonderfully ordinary. Dorothy arrived with banana bread pudding and hugged me the way she always had, both arms full weight, no hesitation. She stepped back and looked at me properly. Her eyes went bright for just a moment. "You look like yourself," she said. "I feel like myself," I said. "That's new." She squeezed my arm and went to help with the table. Marcus and Kowalski came through the gate, arguing about which route they'd taken. A disagreement that had apparently begun in the car and showed no signs of resolving. I shook both their hands and pulled Marcus into a brief embrace. He held on a second longer than necessary, which told me everything about how the last 6 months had settled in him. Sophie Tron arrived last with 2 bottles of sweet tea already photographing the backyard. She handed me 1 bottle, looked at me the way she looked at things she was trying to understand, and said, "You look different, less like you're carrying something." "Something like that," I said. She nodded as though that confirmed a hypothesis and went to find Austin. The afternoon moved slowly without agenda. Kowalski and Marcus argued about grilling pork. Dorothy told me about her granddaughter's first steps. Austin burned the ribs not catastrophically, but enough that everyone made the diplomatic faces families make when effort and outcome don't quite align. As the sun dropped behind the oak trees, Austin came and sat beside me. He smelled like smoke and dry rub, and the particular combination of effort and good intention that had always been his signature. "Does it still hurt?" he asked, looking at my arms. "The way it used to." "Some days," I said. "Less than it did." He nodded. "Austin," I said. "You know what these scars are?" He shook his head. "They're a record. Every one of them is a moment I chose someone else over myself. I looked down at my arms in the last of the October light. I used to look at them and think about what I'd lost. I don't anymore. What do you think about now? I think about where they point, I said. Every scar points somewhere. Marcus, you, 3 soldiers in Kandahar, your mother. I paused. Everywhere worth going. He put his hand over mine on the arm of the chair and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that the gesture didn't already cover. Sophie was taking photographs of the sunset. Kowalski was losing the argument about mint in sweet tea. Dorothy was smiling at something Marcus had said. I leaned back and let the Alabama sun fall across my neck, my arms, the places where the skin had never grown back quite right, and I let it come. The warmth, the smoke, the sound of people I loved moving through an ordinary afternoon. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter than both. Something that felt for the first time in longer than I could remember, like being exactly where I was supposed to be. People ask me what I learned from all of this. Here is my honest answer. Fire can destroy skin, but only selfishness can destroy a soul. I carried these scars for 50 years, believing they made me less. I was wrong. Every scar on my neck, every mark on my shoulder, they are not damage. They are a record of every moment I chose love over safety. I am not a perfect father. I made mistakes. I stayed quiet too long. I believed excuses that should have been questioned. If this grandpa story taught me anything, it is this: do not wait for the people you love to show you who they are. They will tell you. Listen the first time. I believe that no family wound is too deep for truth to reach. I believe that forgiveness is not weakness, it is the hardest kind of strength. And I believe, as Pastor Webb reminded me that night, that God sees the difference between a man who walks into fire and a man who starts one. This is not just my story. This is a family story as old as love itself, a story about what we owe each other and what we owe ourselves. If this grandpa story stayed with you, if this family story reminded you of someone you love, share it. Leave a comment below and tell me what would you have done in my place. Subscribe so you never miss another family story like this one. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements created for entertainment and reflection. If this type of content is not for you, we respect that. Please feel free to explore other content that better fits what you are looking for.